And it's a special pleasure to welcome back to the Varied Institute Professor Edward Larson, who's from Pepperdine University in the USA. Professor Larson indeed is professor. He has two separate chairs. Believe it or not, I've never understood how he manages to sit on two chairs at the same time, but he does. One is in law, and one is in the history of Pepperdine University. So he's a professor of both law and of history in the same university. A very busy man, and also has a whole background, a biography you can read in your handouts in terms of his own legal profession. He's also a Pulitzer Prize winner for his great book on the Scopes trial in the States. He's written very widely in the whole field of the history of science and religion. And so today he's going to speak to us in particular about this topic, Darwinism, eugenics, and religion. So thanks very much, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you for having me here. It's just a delight to be back here in Cambridge. And such an honor to follow John. Indeed, it may sound a bit like a mutual admiration society. I know Dennis, I know there must be a sort of an intelligent designer at least behind these conferences, because it seemed like this could fit as an example of the broad story that we just heard from John, a focused story. Now, I don't know exactly why Rodney, who was probably the true intelligent designer of this and not Dennis, Rodney organized it this way, but what it does indirectly, and I'll just give a little précis before I begin. As we heard from John, there are many episodes in the so-called relationship, conflict, warfare, depends on what view you take, of science and religion. And most of them, as told in most of the best known ones, most of them, not all, but most of them, are hailed as wonderful triumphs for science over religion. And that episode is put in that way, and then people try to retell it the other way in the complexity theory approach that is made famous by John and by Ron Numbers and Dave Lindbergh and many others. And indeed has so swept the field that in the way that John tells us that it's the dominant view and people look at it accordingly. And so we hear about Galileo and I guess Scopes in the United States and Bruno and the various different, and the Huxley-Wilberforce debates. But the one that does sometimes get told on the other side is eugenics. That here's an example of the warfare between science and religion, or the conflict, or the interaction where religion wins. As Galileo famously quipped in a letter that the Bible tells us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. That it's the moral laws, as you said, and not the physical laws. And here the moral laws run out and were proved to be true. Just look at Ostis. That proves it. Well, as we heard just now from a variety of different instances with John, it's a more complex story than that. And it's a more complex story on the other side as well. It's a much, much, much more complex story when you're dealing with eugenics as well. It's not a simple story where science proposed this and religion slew it. Religion was right, science was wrong. And so that, but we often hear it that way. And so we get apologists for science, people in the intelligent design movement, most notably probably the historian Martin Weikart, saying that Darwin was directly responsible for Hitler, Darwin was directly responsible for eugenics, Darwin was directly responsible to racism. Well, if you don't know it, racism was around before Darwin. And it was even more, and it was just as virulent before. Then you get the defenders on the other side, people like Moore, who argues that, Darwinism ended racism. And it was Darwin's sacred cause to abolish slavery and to end racism. We still have it here. Racism still exists. Darwinism and some Darwinists exhibit some of it. So it's a more complex story. And so I'm going to tell a little story about eugenics to try to put it in a larger context and sort of view it as an example, another example that John could have given to illustrate some of the things that he was telling us. Now, if it's true that a picture is worth 10,000 words and my talk is supposed to be about 10,000 words, I could just show this picture, I'll sit down, you can muse on it, because it really, in a way, tells the whole story. This picture was the poster, just like Faraday, where's my Faraday cup, where you have your symbol, and that's supposed to capture whatever Faraday is. There's your symbol. This was the symbol of the Second Eugenics Congress, International Eugenics Congress in 1920. This was their poster. This was on all their little, their cards and their correspondence. And notice what it says. It says, so there's eugenics, and this was when eugenics was at its ideal peak. This is when it was flowering and seen as the future for a greater civilization. And notice that it says it's coming from many different sources. But if you try to use a ruler or a measuring stick and try to figure out which are its biggest sources, because this is how eugenicists perceived it when it was all viewed as good, when it was viewed as the light of the future. You'll see that the biggest roots are statistics and genetics. And evolution isn't even listed. It's not even in the list. Now, evolution is in the definition. Eugenics is a self-direction of human evolution. So it's in that definition, in the identity, but it's not even, Darwinism isn't even perceived as a root. You don't see evolution anywhere. Medicine, surgery, some other things, but statistics and genetics are the two largest ones. As odd as it sounds, I think this image, this self-image, is worth pursuing, and that's what I'll try to do this morning for you, to try to give what I view as a broader view of where eugenics was coming from. And I think in the process we'll see how it fits in with Darwinism, how it fits in with evolutionary biology, and how it fits in with religion. So let me take these two. Let's start with the statistics one, because actually that's, by the pictures, slightly larger. By all accounts, written by eugenicists themselves, the father of eugenics was not Charles Darwin. It was his first cousin, the inventor of modern statistics, Francis Galton. So by that figuring, I suppose that Darwin would then be the first cousin once removed of eugenics. If Galton was the father, I guess that would put Darwin over on the side. And that's probably about right. Now, how does this statistics play into the roots of eugenics? In the tradition of, and it requires following a couple of roots of what made eugenics a plausible idea. In the tradition of we've already heard about Lamarck, as John described Lamarck as the first modern complete theory of respectable theory of evolution. In the spirit of Lamarck, who had profound influences throughout the 19th century in evolutionary thought, much more so than the typical English or American history of evolution says. Most 19th century evolutionists, including Charles Darwin, maintained that at least some characteristics acquired by individuals during their lifetime were passed down to their descendants. Actually read any later editions of Origin of Species, acquired characteristics is central to Darwin's idea of how where variation comes from that begins selected by natural selection. Now, Darwin came to regard acquired characteristics and other environmentally induced alterations in appearance hereditary material, which he called gamules, as the major source of inheritable variation fueling evolution. Now, if you take that view of it, and you want to project it onto eugenical thinking, and eugenical thinking is, as it says, the definition, eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. Okay, we're smart beings now. We've got a mind. Why let evolution happen blindly? Let's take it and evolve things the way we want them. Like better rice. Let's put vitamins right in the rice so that people eating the rice are healthier. Let's take tobacco and make it grow in salt water so we don't have to use that precious fresh water. Let's take evolution and guide it. Let's recreate mosquitoes so they become sterile and they don't end up spreading malaria. And let's do that with people as well. That's what we're thinking about. Re-engineering our crops, re-engineering our biology. And let's do it to people. Now, if you believe in acquired characteristics, as Darwin did, and as Galton, as Darwin did, you're not going to be that worried about the less fit. Because if they breed with others, the less fit will either naturally die off, as Darwin believed they would, because they'd be less fit in a struggle for survival, or they will adapt during their lifetime to the situation and then pass on those improvements to the next generation. So you're not going to be too worried. You're going to think, sure, there may be something to eugenics, but not too much. It's not going to be a major issue. The less fit are either going to die out or they're going to improve during their lifetime, or you can train them, you can educate them, you can send them to schools. And remember, this was a period when they built all sorts of schools for the mentally retarded and schools for the developmentally disabled and schools for this and schools for that, schools for the blind. They can try to change them. That's what you're going to lead to. You're not going to lead to the Holocaust. Now, Galton's key insight, the one that makes him a father of eugenics, one of them, was the concept of hard heredity. That is, Galton was a British independent sort of gentleman scholar, as I say, a first cousin of Charles Darwin. And unlike Charles Darwin, he believed in hard heredity. That is, heredity that cannot change during one's lifetime. He was just absolutely convinced of it. And he would do all sorts of rhetorical devices to sort of push that point. That became Galton's sort of mantra. He'd push it in all sorts of different ways. He was a very popular writer. He was a traveler first. He was a travel writer. He was a he knew everyone. He was well connected. Nobody really liked him. He was a little insufferable because he was very full of himself. But Darwin couldn't stand him around the house. But he was very quick and very bright. He was a member of all the right clubs in London. So he'd write these articles for the for the elite press, and books, and he invented a whole round. He invented some truly amazing discoveries, like the anticyclone. He conceived there was anticyclones and then proved that they existed, things like that. And he invented modern statistics. We'll see the chi-square and all the theories of modern statistics. Now, in one article, he sort of captured it. In his earliest public work in heredity, he wrote the rhetorical questions. Will our children be more virtuous if we ourselves have acquired virtuous habits? No, they won't be any more virtuous, and he could give lots of examples. Or are we no more than passive transmitters of a nature we have received in which we have no power to modify? Yes, of course we are. Now, seeking a material base for this hereditary information, Galton commandeered Darwin's theory of gammules and turned it to his own ends. For Darwin, gammules represented indivisibly small bits of hereditary information collected from every part of both parents and transmitted during reproduction into the offspring. So little bits of all of us would go somehow into the sperm and somehow into the egg. And they would be collected during one's lifetime so they could include acquired characteristics. Like if you built your muscles up, they would be, wherever you used more, much like Lamarck, whatever aspirate you used more, you'd have more gammules coming from there, more particles, and so that's how acquired characteristics could be passed on. Now, Galton accepted the basic idea of particulate gammules, which he called germs or genes, which become our modern genes. But unlike Darwin, he maintained that they remain distinct within the body during our entire life. They were as they were at conception. And it guided its development, guided our development, where we're never fundamentally impacted by it. In reproduction, unmodified germs from both parents combine to compose the germs or the genes of their offspring. Now, as long as no new hereditary information enters the equation, such as by acquired characteristics which he rejected, or spontaneous mutations at conception, which he did accept, Galton asserted that normal, continuous variation in the population cannot lead to generational change. Developing new techniques of statistics, and I think I have some pictures of, shows you how big, what an important character he was. This is the entrance to the University of Chicago, and which was built around the time when Galton was most influential, and he is at one end of this great arch when you're entering it. There's Darwin himself. There is Galton as a cousin, as you see, of Darwin. Eugenicists loved to chart the inheritance of ability, which is Galton's focus, and there's Galton coming down, and there's Darwin and their interrelationships. Would be an example of ability. Now, as long as that no new information comes in, then what you'd have is, this is the statistics that he figured out. He invented this sort of chart. You would have normal continuous variations in a population cannot lead to generational change. He developed the modern theories of statistics to prove his point. He calculated that successive generations descending even from the most gifted individual will naturally regress to the special or racial norm because they will have to marry with normal people or more normal people, and the offspring will work back toward the norm. Sustained selection for the same trait in both parents, such as results from environmental pressure or eugenic mating, can slow the regression. That is, if you constantly mate the best with the best, you can for a while stay down here, because if you can have these mate, your offspring's going to be down in here, because you don't get any new information. Your offspring was down in here. You mate with here, your offspring will be down in here. That's what he thought. So if you have this sustained mating, you can try to keep families up. And so this led him to encourage in his writings to the British public, mostly in elite journals that were only read by people that he perceived were down in here, like the Fortnightly Review and the 19th Century Journal, 19th Century, journals like that, as well as his books. Try to marry people into this area, and you can stay on this good side. That's what became known. And to do this, he coined the term, this is eugenics, which is from Greek, from well-born. And he was preaching to this. Well, you can pretty well guess your views of late Victorian England. He was preaching to the choir. They already thought they should be marrying people over in here, because they had their view of the hoi polloi down here. But it never led him to encourage that we want to kill these people or sterilize these people or prevent them from marrying, because when they intermarry, they're going to work their way up the hill. Because even if somebody way down here, if they marry someone in here, they'll regret, they'll go back to the special norm. And we need the special norm. So it doesn't push him at negative eugenics, it pushes him to invent positive eugenics. But again, it was hardly a revolutionary insight in thinking for Victorian England. It mostly put a scientific gloss on what the Victorian elite already thought. And that's a lot of the story that John was talking about. He made it sound scientific. He invented bell curves, which were unknown before. He invented the chi-square, which were unknown before, to prove a point everybody ever thought anyway. Now, this idea of hard heredity was a Galtonian emphasis. Now, by 1900, Galton was far from alone in accepting hard heredity as among science. It gained more and more followers. And if you notice then, how does change come about? If you can't have acquired change during your lifetime, as Darwin thought, where does directional change come from? Well, it must come from mutations that happen at birth. That's what Galton had gotten to. And more people, such as scientists, went that way. Weizmann in Germany, a whole variety of people in England got inspired by Galton's thought. Bateson and Pearson and Welton. Now, it received a strong boost of scientific evidence from the great Dutch botanist Hugo de Vries. This is going to lead to the second element that led to eugenics. Let's see. Oh, there's Weizmann here, some of the people working in this area. Get it to go. Oh, there's this one. Yeah. It was the evening primrose. Working with the evening primrose, Hugo de Vries, who was already thinking on this way, the only way we get change are these mutations at birth, because we don't have acquired characteristics. He found in the evening primrose a plant that seemed to mutate randomly and dramatically. In America, it was this fellow, Thomas Hunt Morgan, with the fruit fly, who saw these dramatic mutations at birth, all around 1900. Now, with this idea, this stronger view that evolution doesn't occur in little steps, tiny minute changes, as Darwin thought, and acquired characteristics, but rather gross mutations at birth is the only way we get anywhere. Because otherwise, you're going to be pulled back to the special norm and you're not going to go anywhere without gross mutations. That led these people working it, like Hugo de Vries, to do literature searches to back up their literature. And lo and behold, they bumped in the articles that had been written by Gregor Mendel 40 years before, which had statistical studies of pea plants that you all know about that perfectly fit what Hugo de Vries and Thomas Hunt Morgan and dozens of other people were now looking at because they had been inspired by Galton. Which brings us to the second root of eugenics. Because so far, we don't get anywhere toward eugenics with just Darwin. We get, except the general idea that of evolutionary progress and survival of the fittest. With Galton, you get to positive eugenics. Now, though Mendel would never have wanted it that way, when you bump upon the second element, which was in the root, that root of genetics, you end up with the removal of the second roadblock to the widespread acceptance of eugenics as we view it. Now, just as I'd said about that most mid-19th century evolutionists believed in acquired characteristics, Galton and then Weissman and others to overthrow that. Most late 19th century biological and social scientists, including Galton, but of course also Darwin, subscribed to a blending view of heredity, under which one's children inherit a blend of their children's or ancestral traits. Remember when I used the charts that Galton invented, and I said they're going to be somewhere in the middle. We don't think that way after Mendel's rediscovery. No, we now think the traits are either or sort of traits. But back then they thought it was sort of a blend. You were halfway between your mother and your father, or halfway between the pea plants. Not like Mendel had found, they're either green or yellow. No, they'd be halfway between. Spottled, I guess, half green, half yellow, which look like the pea plants with the weather the way it's been this year in England. That's about how they look, spottled, but that's how they saw them. Now, under this view, as Galton had demonstrated with his regression analysis, the challenge lay not so much in pulling inferior families up to the special or racial norm, because that happened naturally through crossbreeding. The puzzle became how to keep superior families like himself and those of his friends up. Keep them up. Isn't that a challenge of the British upper class today? Aren't they still worried about how we keep up and we don't get the riffraff in? Well, in 1900, from a whole raft of scientists rediscovered Mendel's work, and which suggested that parental and other ancestral traits reappear in children and more remote descendants without blending. From its rediscovery, mutation theorists embraced Mendelianism as showing how discontinuous variation are propagated. They founded the classical school of modern genetics within a generation, within actually a dozen years after the rediscovery of Mendel. And they soon became calling themselves geneticists, from the term that had come through gametes, through genes, through germs to genes, that evolution of the terms. Now, during the 1920s and 1930s, early geneticists like R.A. Fisher here in England and J.B.S. Haldane here also in Britain demonstrated mathematically how Mendelian processes could account for the evolution of new species through normal, seemingly continuous inborn variations. Now, that's a known story. What makes it interesting is, for these people, for all of these geneticists, I have not found a dissenter, whether it's Thomas Hunt Morgan or Fisher or Haldane, and you could rattle off the names. For all of them, this made the case for negative eugenics, which Galton had never been pushing. Negative eugenics is cutting off the weak as opposed to encouraging the fit, cutting off the unfit as opposed to cutting off the fit. Now, why did it do that? Well, if there are superior and inferior hereditary traits, they reasoned, and if the impact of those traits in succeeding generations is unalterable by environmental influences or blending, then eugenic solutions were as necessary for the unfit as the fit. Only the unfit are unlikely to realize it. With the fit, you can educate them. You can write in the Fortnightly Review, and they will start breeding eugenically. Well, they'll have their dalliances, but their intentional breeding will be eugenic. But now you've got to impose it on the unfit, is the way they're thinking. And they are scientists, definitely. These are the leading, can you beat R.A. Fisher? Most important, probably, person in the history of evolutionary thought of the 20th century. Oxford fellow, right? Not Cambridge.
Cambridge.
Oh, he's Cambridge too? Oh my gosh. R.A. Fisher, right here. You're right. Wrong one. Galton was an Oxford fellow. I believe Galton was Oxford. And so more children from the fit, less from the unfit becomes the published motto. You'll see it on some of the charts I could have showed you from the Eugenics Society from the 1920s and beyond. Now, of course, the triumph of eugenics built on a history of greater public acceptance of hereditarianism in general, and of competitive struggle for existence as a driving force for social and economic progress. It only took a slight twist of reasoning to transpose accepting the natural selection of the fit into encouraging the intentional elimination of the unfit. Now, what process developed? Even though eugenics was born in Britain, the methods for its coercive application principally developed first in the United States. And those in the United States at that time was a matter of state law. It wasn't a matter of national law. That's when all those issues of public policy in that sense are state issues. And so what you see is a flowering in America of most of the states adopting laws, eugenical restrictions on who can marry, programs of sexual segregation that you take the grossly unfit, be they epileptics or mentally retarded or the severely mentally ill. And again, at this time, they were thinking that these were simple Mendelian traits. A change is going to come when you don't think of them as simple Mendelian traits. But if you think mental retardation and schizophrenia are simple Mendelian traits, like the green and the yellow pea plant, then the idea is, because that's what they're thinking, whether you're R.A. Fisher or Thomas Hunt Morgan, just stop the one from breeding through segregating them during the reproductive years or involuntary sterilization, sterilizing them. You're going to cut off that weakness. And that becomes the methods of negative eugenics. The vast majority of American states, 35 out of 48 states, adopt programs of compulsory sterilization. They all had voluntary sterilization programs, but this is forced sterilization of the institutionalized mentally ill and mentally retarded, often epileptics and other groups, less so other groups, mostly those. Sometimes habitual criminals, but those are always problematic in America, mostly because habitual criminals didn't seem to be a hereditary trait, so it didn't have a scientific background. Basis. The opposition to sterilizing criminals is this is purely punitive, this is not hereditary to be a criminal. And so states would pass them and they'd quickly be thrown out by the courts. But there was strong scientific basis at that time that mental illness and mental retardation were Mendelian traits. And so those laws were consistently upheld by the courts. And so you have state after state adopting such programs. American geneticists uniformly supported this negative eugenics movement during its formative years, as did many, probably most, psychologists, sociologists, social workers, physicians, cultural geographers, and anthropologists. Their professional organizations generally followed suit, most notably the American Genetics Association. And virtually all state and national medical societies in America did so as well. A few elite philanthropists and foundations provided most of the movement's financial backing, particularly the Carnegie Institute, the widow of railroad magnate E.H. Harriman, California financier E.S. Scotchley, and the Rockefeller Foundation. Now, I think I've got, there is R.A. Fisher. There is a eugenics certificate for marriage. Here are the states that passed eugenical sterilization laws. You can see it pretty well sweeps the country. Here is the Eugenic Records Office funded by Harriman and the Carnegies. It's Cold Spring Harbor, where it's still well known as an important biological research station, headed until recently by James Watson. Who had some connection with Cambridge. He did something here. He bumped into something or other here in Cambridge.
It was Cambridge
down the road. I said Cambridge. I know that was Cambridge. That was the. So how does this fit with religion part now? Religion fits right into this. Eugenicists, as John says, they build these connections. There are many different churches. And there are churches that are looking for insights through science, trying to work with science, trying to collaborate. Eugenicists in America, which they swept the scientific community, actively courted the favor of reform-minded clerics in the United States during the 20s. The American Eugenics Society, for example, formed a committee for cooperation with the clergy. That was its title. that, among other activities, sponsored eugenic sermon contests. These competitions apparently tapped a reservoir of support. I've read their files because they attracted literally thousands of sermons from across the country. The minister would give it and then submit it in hope of a prize, a monetary prize, mind you, of how this sermon embraced eugenical thinking and eugenical ideas. Most of them came from Protestant ministers. The sermons typically proclaimed Christian authority for selective breeding and linked the spiritual. You can imagine the dynasties that from David on down to Christ, often figuring in these sermons. And they linked spiritual advancement of humans to their hereditary endowment. Some trace the eugenical attributes of Christ's pedigree, while others foresaw the millennium arriving through genetic improvement of humanity. Those would be the clearly Wilsonian post-millennialists of liberal Christianity. John D. Rockefeller, the funder of much of this, his minister, Fosdick, at the Riverside Church in America, was a leading proponent of eugenics, as was Rockefeller himself, a very devout liberal Baptist. University of Chicago theologian Charles Gilkey was tremendously involved. He was a member of the Central Board. He was a member of the Committee of Cooperation with Clergy, as was Harry Emerson Fosdick, who I just mentioned. The president of the Federal Council of Churches, F.J. MacDonald was, and other prominent American religious leaders served on this committee and endorsed eugenics solutions to social problems. At the state level, and I've studied this, progressive ministers assumed a very visible position lobbying for eugenical restrictions on in law for marriage. The pattern followed here in England and in Northern Europe. In England, for example, the Convocation of the Church of England, I think that's what's called the Convocation, that's what I've written down, and several key Methodist church leaders endorsed the 1912 Mental Deficiency Bill, a highly controversial proposal that did not pass to impose compulsory eugenics here in Britain. Leading British eugenicists regularly appealed to support from liberal religious audiences, and the Anglican dean of, is it St. Paul? St. Peter? St. Paul, I think it's St. Paul or Westminster, I'm not sure, Dean Ing, assumed the most prominent leadership role in the national eugenics movement. Of course, Winston Churchill was their strongest advocate in the administration, in the Asquith administration. Asquith administration pushed for compulsory eugenics here, and it was through Winston Churchill, who was the prime proponent, but Lady Asquith was also a very strong supporter. Theologically liberal ministers provide similar support for eugenical lawmaking in Scandinavian and other Protestant regions of Europe. This apparent alliance of scientific and religious authority in support of eugenical doctrines may have simply reflected recognition that ministers were effective public spokespersons for the cause. But clearly, many of these clerics willingly allowed scientific theories to inform their spiritual beliefs. Now, on the other side, this is the story that showing warfare. They pick up on this. Based on its religious commitment to the sanctity of all human life, regardless of biological fitness, in the United States and to an extent elsewhere, the Roman Catholic Church did emerge during this process as the first and really only, well, the labor unions were opposed to it too, so I shouldn't say only, but certainly the first major organization to challenge eugenic doctrines. Catholic resistance stiffened as eugenics movement began advocating sterilization, which the church denounced as violating the so-called natural law linking sexual activity with procreation. In 1930, the Pope issued an encyclical on this point. Wherever eugenical legislation surfaced in the United States, local Catholic clerics, lay leaders, physicians took the lead in opposing it. This opposition proved decisive in defeating eugenical sterilization laws in such heavily Catholic states as Pennsylvania, New York, and Louisiana, helped stop eugenic legislation from passing here in Britain, and prevented the spread of eugenic restriction to the Catholic regions of Europe and the Americans. Indeed, if I went back to that map, you could almost chart where there are major Catholic populations with the few states that did not pass forced sterilization laws. Except for Utah, there's a perfect correlation. The Mormons also opposed it, so that explains Utah. The rest, it's only Catholic states where it stopped, or strongly Catholic states. Well, in many ways, the American eugenics became a model for other countries. Most Canadian provinces followed their U.S. counterparts in enacting eugenic restrictions on reproduction, as did most Australian states, beginning with the passage of Germany's law, quote, Law for the Prevention of Genetically Diseased Progeny, which was proposed during the Weimar Republic and passed in 1933. It was modeled in part on California's compulsory sterilization law. Every Nordic nation in Europe adopted stern eugenics legislation. A scattering of Eastern European countries such as Romania and some Asian countries and Latin American countries acted as well as did many British colonies. But again, not the UK itself. Now, Germany's 1933 law, which was the most far-reaching such statute enacted anywhere, by far, mandated the sterilization of persons determined by a eugenic health course, which were composed of doctors. Sterilization, and here I'll give the list, at least the way I translate it. Congenital feeble-mindedness, which means mental retardation. Schizophrenia, manic depressive, severe physical deformity, hereditary epilepsy, Huntington's cholera, hereditary blindness or deafness, or severe alcoholism. I think that would have got a lot of the Germans, but they didn't. That last one I'm talking about. As the noted German geneticist, probably the leading German geneticist at the time, Erwin Bauer, he wrote, "We must see to it that these inferior people do not procreate. No one approves of the new law more than I do, but I must repeat over and over and over that they constitute only the beginning." And in the text, the beginning is underlined or italicized. I think I've got his picture. Oh, there's a picture. There's from Germany. I think it's, yeah, looking at a flower? Yeah, it should be there. It should be flower. Some 300,000 persons, which is about 10 times more than in California, where the law operated for 40 years. 300,000 persons were sterilized under this law between 1933 and 1939, when it was replaced by a euthanasia program designed to rid the fatherland, then engaged in a costly world war that you too know something about, of its mentally handicapped children, as it was referred to in the law. Virtually the entire German genetics community, which was one of the largest and best in the world at the time, joined Bauer in supporting eugenical sterilization and other Nazi efforts to expand eugenic research and application. Even before the Nazis took power, such renowned German geneticists as Bauer, Fritz Lenz, and Hermann Muckermann, a Catholic lay leader and former priest, worked notions of Nordic racial superiority into their eugenics. Adolf Hitler read their writings during his rise, and once in power, his party sought to support for eugenics from geneticists to publicly. They encouraged geneticists to step forward and support their policies. German geneticists freely gave it. They joined the party in numbers disproportionate to other professions and turned research at the prestigious Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, which is there, the Nazi flag flying, toward Nazi ends. In return, geneticists received generous state support and a free flow of involuntary human subjects, which they used in cutting-edge but morally bankrupt research. In her 2010 book, historian Sheila Faith Weiss termed it a Faustian bargain that led to a symbiotic relationship between German geneticists and the Third Reich. Well, the tide of popular opinion began turning against eugenics and social Darwinism in the 1930s. Shocked by what was happening in Germany, a new breed of social scientists led by American anthropologists Franz Boas and Margaret Mead challenged the hereditary assumptions underlying eugenics. The worldwide economic depression that started during the late 1920s and persisted into the 1930s caused many people to question the simple equation of hereditary fitness with social and economic success. The exposure of racist, ethnic, and religious uses of eugenics by the Nazi government in Germany settled the matter. But, and this is my closing last long point, but the lesson learned from this for science, for geneticists, and for many others was on the government imposition of negative eugenics, not a lesson learned about the voluntary use of positive eugenics, which continued, and indeed gained favor, even among the Catholic laity, and especially among liberal Protestants. Following World War II, philanthropists still interested in such matters, such as the Rockefeller Foundation, shifted their support from compulsory eugenical sterilization programs at home to population control efforts in developing countries and facilitating and encouraging voluntary birth control at home. Most geneticists also backed away from their earlier support for compulsory eugenics, particularly as they increasingly realized that most behavioral and mental traits, such as most forms of mental retardation, for example, involve such a complex interaction of multiple genes that they could not be addressed by simple solutions of sterilization or sexual segregation. Those who did not step back from that position, like R.A. Fisher, who never did, lost public prestige and professional posts as a result. Now, although geneticists may have repudiated compulsory sterilization and increasingly shied away from using the politically incorrect term eugenics, they truly never abandoned the hope for improving humanity through genetics. Indeed, you can go through, you can talk to them privately, and you can read the more candid ones publicly, like James Watson. They will acknowledge that it was this hope of improving the human race and reducing human disability that inspired them to do genetics in the first place. Within the upper echelon of biologists, say William Hamilton here in England or James Watson in the United States, and others spoke openly of achieving such ends through individual, voluntary reproductive choices made in light of expanded genetic knowledge. During the late 20th century, the discovery of DNA structure here in Cambridge by Watson and Francis Crick, followed by the mapping of the human genome, which again was initially led by James Watson, the advent of genetic screening, the increased use of in vitro fertilization, and the promise of germline gene therapy gave substance to their hopes. With prenatal genetic testing and in vitro fertilization, by the turn of the current century, by the year 2000, parents could begin to select the genotype of their children. For some, it has become a new eugenics, and its prospects continue to grow. At their conferences and in their publications, leading genome researchers hail the implications of the discovery for combating human disability and hint at their promise for human enhancement. Nobel laureate Walter Gilbert writes, quote, "A whole variety of human susceptibilities will be recognized as having genetic origins. The ability to test for these genes will mean both a sharper diagnosis of the condition and a sharper prognosis of what should be done about it." Similar, genome pioneer Leroy Hood, probably the key person in making the human genome mapping work, promises, quote, "Human germline engineering is a discipline of the future. Its objectives will be to reverse genetic defects and to enhance desirable human traits such as emotional stability, intelligence, or longevity." Jim Watson, again the founding director of the Mapping Project in America and the co-discoverer of DNA structure, adds, "In combating disease, genetics helps enormously. If it's a bad gene that contributes to the cause. Ignoring genes is like trying to solve a murder without finding the murderer. All we have is victims," he's talking about the condition, With time, if we find the genes for Alzheimer's disease or manic depressive, we can effectively cure them. In this context, it matters little whether human traits or conditions are labeled as disabilities or abilities, diseases or enhancements. Biology may create a physical or mental condition, but only societies or individuals can interpret it as normal or abnormal, as ability or disability. People will differ on what they favor and disfavor. In various controversial offhand remarks, which led to him being fired as director of the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, Watson has suggested that the emerging genetic intervention can lead to smarter men, prettier women, and fewer homosexuals. Others may make different choices, however, such as for athleticism or against Huntington's cholera. At a minimum, proponents argue some hereditary conditions are genetically disfavored, while others are highly valued, and parents should be allowed to choose among them within broad social norms. To some, this is the ultimate freedom, to choose your offspring's traits. For others, it is the ultimate oppression, to have your traits selected. These prospects remain largely futuristic. At the present time, gene testing represents the only widespread applications of current genetic technology for humans. Tests exist for genetic factors associated with thousands of conditions, ranging from ones like breast cancer or schizophrenia that are generally regarded as disabling, and to others that people widely value, such as height or intellectual creativity. These tests are now typically prescribed by physicians in three basic situations, all of which involve patients perceived to be at risk for specific disabling conditions based on their families or personal experiences. Predictive gene testing before you marry, before you have offspring, carrier testing for asterisk populations, and prenatal testing of at-risk fetuses for disabilities such as cystic fibrosis that run in families or ethnic groups. As the number of identifiable disabling genes and the ease of testing increases, widespread genetic screening of individuals, populations, and fetuses may become the norm. These, in turn, are used to make individual reproductive decisions. The new eugenics, as some have called it. In the future, and for those with means, human gene therapy may offer a way to modify the human genome in vitro or in utero, either to eliminate defects or add enhancements. Similar procedures are now widely used to genetically engineer crops and livestock. Given how much wealthy individuals are willing to pay to provide advantages to their children, such as through private schooling and medical procedures, surely some parents will grasp at opportunities to enhance their children genetically. But that remains for the future. So, bring us back to our opening question, and actually finishing a little early and time for plenty of questions. So, who's to blame for eugenics? Well, we see lots of people. It goes around. Different scientists, different religious figures. And what sort of eugenics? The old eugenics, the new eugenics. Voluntary eugenics, involuntary eugenics. Negative eugenics, positive eugenics. Certainly it is not simply the theory of Darwinian evolution, which can invoke mechanisms such as those believed in by Darwin that are antithetical to eugenics. The Darwinian emphasis on selection as an engine of evolution presumably contributed to a social environment that was conducive to eugenics. But, as historians have so pointed out so many times, such social thinking was growing before Darwin published his theory, and indeed helped to inspire Darwin to that theory. Itself, it's not sufficient to sustain eugenical practices. In science, it took the rejection of a belief in both blended heredity and the inheritance of acquired characteristics for eugenics to begin to gain widespread support. And it's in its compulsory and negative form, this lasted only until people realized that both genetics did not operate as simply on humans as it does on Mendel's pea plants, and that no government should be trusted with the power over reproductive decisions. It did take an English agnostic and an Austrian abbot to lay the scientific foundations for eugenics. But that English agnostic was Galton, not Darwin. And neither he nor the Austrian abbot, Gregor Mendel, ever imagined how their ideas would be used by the Nazis in the 30s or by modern genetic counselors today. Thank you.
Wow, thanks very much indeed for that, Ed. Fantastic overview. Question from the back. Thank you, Karen.
Well, hello from Seattle Pacific.
How are you?
Hello.
Thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how someone like Sewell Wright plays into this, since he thought drift was such an important mechanism and also talked a lot about adaptive landscape, so it would be a specific environment if selection was acting where things would matter.
Sewell Wright, I only met him a couple times. Sewell Wright, if you don't know, was a very important American. When Americans tend to write the story of the modern neo-Darwinian synthesis, which was what became dominant. I don't know if it's still dominant because there's so much view on gene flows now, and there's so much epigenesis beliefs, and it's so evolving right now. But certainly for a window from 1940 to 1990, it would have been the dominant view of evolution. It brought together every strand. It was popularized by a Brit, Huxley. What was he, a nephew of Page? Grandnephew? Julian Huxley? Grandson? Because his brother just died. The Nobel Prize winner, his brother just died, yeah. Half-brother. And in America by a Russian, Theodore Dostoevsky, who had moved to America. The three people who are viewed as key is R.I. Fisher and Haldane and Sewell Wright. Now, you don't get the story quite that way in England. Sewell Wright gets a lower level of activity. But you'd think that his ideas of adaptive landscapes might lead him to have a somewhat different view of eugenics. But he was a true believer. This is one of the puzzling things about eugenics, is you can find people who logically who should, like philosophy. A great question about philosophy this morning. You can take it, and actually I'm a historian, not a philosopher, that's an understatement. But if you follow the pure ideas, and it was what I was trying to follow, the pure ideas, these are the steps that you need. But if you actually take people who don't fall into it, I think it's because people can take science and put it in their lens of their own experience and then come to their own conclusions. So you can take Darwinism and be a racist, or you can be against racism. And we have great examples. Darwin would, and in fact you can find it in Darwin's own writing. When he was writing the Wedgwood wing of his family, who were all abolitionists, he would write these wonderful letters of how my ideas will end racism. But you can find him writing to racists, and it sounds very different. It's the same way if you find him writing to Asa Gray, you'd think that Darwinism was a very pious, pro-religious thing. But if he was writing nasty letters to Huxley, they sound quite different. I think Darwin liked to be liked, and I think he was pushing his ideas. He was a promoter of his ideas, and he would tweak them this way and that way. And you find this in Sewell Wright. Sewell Wright came, I think it was his background. Sewell Wright came out of a background, he was an employee of the U.S. Agriculture Department. And he was engaged, his job was breeding cattle, better strains of cattle, and better strains of animals. And so from that experience, he believed that his ideas fit the eugenic approach because he was an animal breeder. That's what he was. And his one discovery, which started as a drawing, which made him famous, was really not integral to his scientific work. His scientific work was longhorn and short-horned camel and the breeding and some other breeding for the agriculture department. So it turns out he subscribes to the eugenical ideas and argues that his theories help back them. But if you're a philosopher and you're looking at it, if you say, no, this should have led him a somewhat different direction. R.A. Fisher, who would have been a classical, his ideas, all of his work should have supported the most precise form of negative eugenics. That fit his sort of thinking, which was large populations, cutting out, and his idea was cutting out every generation, cut out the lowest 10%. Find out the lowest 10% and prevent them from breeding, and then prevent the next, and then prevent. It's no good just breeding the able. You're not going to get anywhere. He wasn't like Galton. Even though he held the Galton chair, he wasn't like Galton. Galton, you breed the best, and that will have this elite. The others will either die off or take care of themselves. And that's more the thinking of Winston Churchill. That's more the thinking of Teddy Roosevelt. That's more, those people who were Woodrow Wilson in America, who were strong proponents. Calvin Coolidge, didn't matter ideology, you get a conservative and a liberal. Those strong supporters of eugenicists tended to think that way. It was the scientist, and it was using R.A. Fisher's thought that pushed them to this idea, no, we've got to keep cutting off the bottom. And that drew in, that was what ended up getting the support of Carnegie, who was, I guess, originally from Britain. I guess he's one you'd call, he was Scotch, I guess. Scotland. He's a Scotsman. Yeah, but so when they're winning at Wimbledon, you call them all Brits, and you forget that they're Scots. But once they lose, they're Scots again. So he switched from being British to Scottish in one day. After the second set, but anyway, that's where he comes. So Sewell Wright's an interesting character to follow through, and you're right. He should have veered off, but you also get that you can find some people who get sucked into it who believed in acquired characteristics. You get some neo-Lamarckians who get sucked into eugenics, and it doesn't make sense. And it's why Darwin, who was actually, you see what he's writing, but I think he always knew what he thought. Darwin never gets pulled. He writes some things that sound supportive in, say, Descent of Man. But otherwise, you'll see private letters where he say, telling his wife and telling others, don't let Galton even come into the house. Never invite him over. Yes. Please. Yes.
Don't you think that the building the elite just never worked out because of the social differences of the gender? In Victorian times, I think a very intellectual woman would have a very, very small chance of reproducing with a smart man. And if you look to modern days, China, by selecting who is allowed to be born, now you have the disaster that you have a lot of boys and no girls. And so all this wonderful thinking of you could create an elite is just not working because smart women are still not want, who wants them?
No, I think you're making a very important point of why it never worked out as they hoped and they dreamed. You can read quite a bit. Let's just play that out in practice. Because I won't. I'll try to be short. But I could go on for an hour in dealing with that question. This is a wonderful question. They realized this problem. These people who were dreaming of a better Britain, and they literally worded it that way. I mean, dreaming of a better. You would see articles in the Medical Journal of Georgia, how to breed better Georgians. That would be their title. They realized that was one of the problems. How do you get these people? So Galton Galton led the crusade. He says one of the worst things that Oxford and Cambridge is doing is we're not letting our professors, our faculty, get married, because they had to be single back then. And he led the push to allow the faculty at Oxford and Cambridge to have families, because these are the people we need. And that was his argument. We need these people to have kids, because his eugenic idea was always pretty much like himself. You know, that was his perfect person. So the smart people, we want them to breed, and we're preventing them. But how do you get the women to breed and other people? So, yeah, in America, to deal with that problem, you know, now in American universities, you're required to take, in most American universities, an environmental literacy course. You know, I think at almost every state university in America, you have to, there's this law that you have to, or a rule at the university that you have to take 1 courses in how to be an environmentally good steward. If you go back to the 1920s, every land-grant university in America, those are the premier state universities in America, there was a requirement that you had to take a course in eugenic mating. You had to take a course in eugenics. It was a mandatory course. And it tried to teach you how to find the eugenically fit mate. And you encouraged the women at the college, you've got to have kids. You've got to get married and have children. It's your duty. Teddy Roosevelt took this very seriously. I mean, and so did Franklin, his cousin. And, you know, his wife was very smart. She wasn't the prettiest person that ever walked down the face of the earth. But she was very smart, and he knew that. They were thinking in these terms. And you had courses in it. The leading high school biology course book at the time, used throughout America, called a civic biology. That was the name of it. It was what was used in all high school. By far the most popular biology book, high school biology book in the 1920s. It had a whole section on eugenic mating. And it told you who you should look for in a mate. And it told women, intelligent women, that they have a duty to society to have children. I mean, R.A. Fisher, having children for him must have been painful. He hated women. But he had all these children. One of them who wrote a fascinating book about it. I mean, what he did to his wife was terrible. It was hellish what he did to his wife. But he had a lot of children with her because he thought it was his duty to Britain. He was an odd man, odd person. And read his daughter's book. It's a great book. So, I mean, dealing with this problem was how to get these people. Because, you know, you're wealthy, you want to do other things. You don't want to have kids, you want to go travel to the south of France or something. But if you have to really push that that's a genetic duty. And so you have books in America that Teddy Roosevelt would write the back for, like the death of a great race, and there's race suicide going on that worried Winston Churchill, that worried Teddy Roosevelt, that worried a generation of Americans who were thinking of. Now they were in the positive eugenics. They were sort of in the Galton. They were in sort of that era before they'd taken both steps to negative eugenics. But those are the sorts of thinkings, and then it follows through with the negative. Then you add the story of how we have to cut off the lower half. But it's a real puzzle, and why it doesn't work out. Sure, you have a twist on it, saying is, well, if we get a smart man and a pretty wife, you'll get the eugenic fitness from both of them. Some people arguing in that respect. Galton did. Galton wrote. One of his publications, I don't know which my favorite is. They're great to read because they're so capture the late Victorianism. But he prepared a beauty map of Britain. And what he did is he went around the country and he analyzed the beauty of the women. It's where you could best pick your mate. And he's English, so Aberdeen comes in last. It's true, Aberdeen's the bottom. And it's a chart. It's where London came in first, and Aberdeen came in last. But so he's thinking that we've got to factor in, sort of like Plato would. He knew a lot about Greece. Obviously, he took the name from the Greek name. And he referred to, in the Republic, Plato talks about these things and advocates the state do these. And Galton picked up on that. That's why he used the Greek name. And so beauty is one of the attributes of athleticism and health. Of course, the sad thing about Galton is, even though he was the father of eugenics, he could have no children. After graduating from Oxford, I think Galton was Oxford? Or was he Cambridge? He was one or the other. He went, I know it's a big difference. He toured the Middle East. in sort of a following of the Richard Burton ideal, say, or the Speaks. Later he does Africa, and he explores. He's the first to explore Southwest Africa. A first white person to explore Southwest Africa. Careful out there. But he contracts a disease, and that he shouldn't have and he becomes impotent himself, so he never has any children, much to his regret.
Can I just add before we have the next question? Just a little story, because I was giving a lecture a couple of years ago when I mentioned the name of Fisher, and the guy came up to me afterwards. He said, "I'm the nephew of R.A. Fisher." So I thought, that was interesting. We got chatting. I mean, this family was extremely dysfunctional, and he was in the Department of Pathology, the original R.A. Fisher desk down the road. But a lot of his children were given away, actually, to the Guinness family to raise. If you ever drink Guinness, it's that family. But those family, mostly, half of them were missionaries in China.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the, several of the Fisher children were actually ended up as missionaries out in China.
Yes.
I just thought it was a great irony in this whole dysfunctional family history that comes out of eugenics.
And his wife's an evangelical Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Fisher's wife, I believe, was an evangelical Christian, and she was also committed to the importance of having children, and she was very able. She was very smart, and some of the children are brilliant. But it was a very dysfunctional family. That's a good phrase for it.
Please, yes. James. Yes.
Can I ask, today I'm a GP, so I often counsel people about ultrasound investigations for early pregnancy, for Down syndrome, and for sickle cell.
Mm-hmm.
And the government agenda for medicine in general is informed choice.
Mm-hmm.
And these words just throughout everything we do all the time. It occurs to me sometimes to talk to patients in terms of eugenics when discussing these things, but obviously that's quite loaded. I'm just wondering how we should sort of address that today, because it's not a sort of government-led, Churchill-led thing. It's a very much a bottom-up consumer approach to eugenics. If it is eugenics, I'm just wondering
That's
if you could
true.
comment on that.
There's as you probably know better than I. You're on sort of the cutting edge. You're at the being in general practice, dealing with people who are having children. Often genetic counselors get involved, which is a separate discipline. Trained genetic counselors will often be involved, especially if you're dealing with a family where you're dealing with some sort of reason why you have a higher risk, either because of a family history or because of age. You have many states in America, you have countries that are either strongly encouraging or mandating genetic tests for certain individuals. Certainly in the Mediterranean countries, you'd have mandatory tests or strongly encouraged tests for beta thalassemia, which is particularly concentrated in places like Sardinia and places like that. The mantra is always, thank you for that term, the mantra is very much individual choice. But I think correct me if I'm wrong, but if a doctor tells you something is abnormal or something is flagged for some reason, or you have a child who might, it's not a genetic disease, but an example people relate to easily is Down syndrome. It's chromosome, it's not. But it's the same sort of, you hear cystic fibrosis, or Huntington cholera is one thing. Chorea. Huntington's chorea, correct. Thank you. And that's one thing. Tay-Sachs is another thing. That's a dramatic. Beta thalassemia is another thing. Down syndrome, there are different levels of it. But you tell a parent that you have the Down syndrome, or you have something else that sort of stands out. And what's going to be the result? The result, from what I hear, is mostly reproductive choice. We have an abortion. We found with beta thalassemia, the percentage, I read a study in Nature recently, that the incidence of that disease in Sardinia with non-directive counseling, as you're talking about, but mandatory testing, the incidence of disease has dropped 99.9%. Literally every child was aborted but one. That's how that was the 10-year study. I think statistics are remarkably similar, not in America, but in England for Down syndrome. The percentage, the reaction is an abortion. Now, that's a form, from that test with beta thalassemia is different than Down syndrome. But Down syndrome, you don't know the level. When you're making that decision, you don't know the level of how serious the manifestation of it's going to be. But that's the response you get. So, and also some of the things are probability or heightened probability. You don't even know if it's a certainty. So how do you react to that? How do you respond to that? You're the doctor. But what we're finding is people are responding to these voluntary suggestions. Now you have countries like China where it's mandatory. China passed a law that if you have any sort of genetic defect, you have to terminate the pregnancy. That's what the law says. So the law gets followed. I've never really heard it being enforced. It may be enforced locally. I don't know exactly what the situation is. The law was passed in 1994, so we should have a lot of background on it, but I haven't ever seen any of what actually is done. But how do you really need a law if people are reacting the way they are? You're getting percentages that would affect the goals with non-directive. This is under, as you call it, non-directive individual choice. And that's the situation, and it doesn't matter. And it was certainly anticipated. You can read the conferences and presentations of the people who developed this, and this is what they'd anticipated. We don't need the laws. We can just, if we increase our knowledge and get the knowledge out and have the testing and screening, we'll get the results we need.
Okay, yes, yes, yes.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely extraordinary. I think one of the interesting things about the lunacy of eugenics is demonstrating the fact that one of the principal people that Hitler talked to after the beer hole putsch was a British eugenist, unfortunately educated at the University of Geneva, called Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who was a cousin of Neville Chamberlain. And to me, it's absolutely ironic. You've got one cousin advising Hitler, on genetic matters, and another one declaring war against him. But I think the interesting aspect from a theological point of view of this debate is that the Old Testament God is an anthropomorphic God. That's to say, in the human image, whereas the New Testament God is not anthropomorphic. And the irony about Jesus is because he was trying to move the Jewish population to a non-anthropomorphic God, saying, look, God is love, he's not tribal, he ends up getting crucified. And yet the main victims of the the anthropomorphic version, the anthropomorphic approach, was actually the Jews. And that to me is the ultimate irony of the difference between an Old Testament approach to God, an anthropomorphic God, and the New Testament approach towards God, which is essentially spiritual. The main victims have been the people who wouldn't shift their ideas about God.
Interesting story about the Chamberlains that you added. You can certainly see that throughout. I'm not touching on the second part, but the first part, as we mentioned on Chamberlain. Not only did the geneticists strongly back the Nazis, and that doesn't mean they supported the Nazi war effort, that they supported necessarily the Holocaust. That I'm sure these geneticists thought thought there were aspects of Nazism that were just terrible. But there were parts that they thought were well informed, and they would advise them. There were many American eugenicists who went over and toured, including some Jewish eugenicists in America, who went over and toured what was happening in Germany and came back with sort of mixed reviews. Some very, very positive. Clear up till the beginning of the Second World War, there were some American eugenicists who were saying Germany was they were making terrible mistakes in other areas, but in the sterilization programs, they were, and with the medical courts, they were doing it right. And several American eugenicists received honorary degrees from German universities and went over there and received them. And so the Chamberlain example is an example. So there was a give and take. You also had religious groups. You had religious groups backing it. As we said, in Germany was the one place where there was a significant number of Catholics, as well as Jews, who backed the eugenic programs. I mean, Jews, it was in America as well, Jewish leaders. But in Germany, before it was it was turned onto the Jews, you'd find religious geneticists, including Catholics ones, who were supportive. But the Catholic Church was a little different in Germany than it was in Italy or in the United States. I think one of the factors why Catholicism was so strong against eugenics in both Britain and in the United States was the Catholics in those two countries were mostly an immigrant church. And the fear was always that this was going to be disproportionately used on immigrants, because the tests that were used for intelligence were language specific and culturally impacted. And you would see the Catholic opponents, going all the way back to 1910, make the archbishops and the newsletters directly making this comparison. So yes, it is partly, certainly, the historic stance coming from Aquinas, and probably long before, equating reproduction, the sexual activity, with reproduction. That link was certainly important, but you'll see in the Catholic arguments in America, the Roman Catholic arguments, Archbishop, drawing on this will disproportionately be turned on the immigrants, on workers. Now, whether or not that would be the case, I don't know. But those certainly contributed to it. And the best I can tell, and I've written a few articles on British eugenics, that was the same sort of pushing it more, where you would have that less so in Germany. Now, of course, would be less so in Italy, and you don't see this phenomenon in Italy. But of course, Italy was much less a scientific country. In Germany was a very scientifically advanced country, probably the most scientifically advanced country in the world in the first half of the 20th century, before Hitler ruined it.
Chamberlain was married to Wagner's daughter. That's probably why he got an audience.
Okay, we've come to 12:30. I mean, it's a fascinating discussion, a very sobering talk, a fascinating talk. Thank you very much indeed, Ed. So.